Hi, I'm Michael Biggs from the University of Hertfordshire in the UK, and this is the companion presentation to the paper called Writing It Up and Writing It Down, Notation for Interdisciplinary Research. This presentation is part of the Speaking, Writing and Picturing project, which looks at the way in which we annotate our ideas and the impact that has on how our ideas develop and what we can say about them. So the core theory that informs speaking, writing and picturing is that of linguistic relativity. Linguistic relativity is the idea that our natural language, our mother tongue, influences the way we conceptualize the external world. So our language has both vocabulary but also grammatical structures that encourage us to think about the world in particular ways. And there is the potential that these are limiting. And so the target of the Speaking, Writing and Picturing project is how do we facilitate innovation and novelty and originality if there is this background problem of linguistic relativity, that there are habits of thought that might get in the way. And at the moment, what we're particularly looking at is systems of notation, so how we write things down, because linguistic relativity dealt with in the literature, principally in philosophy and linguistics, focuses on spoken language. And so we want to look more broadly at how we write down spoken language, but also how we write down other things. So we don't use English language or Spanish language, for example, for writing down music. We have a special form of notation for that that's been developed for music. But of course, if we think about it in terms of linguistic relativity, musical notation is going to suffer from the same problem, isn't it? It's developed around an idea of Western music, of 12 tones in the octave, and if you start to stray away from that and you look at world music and you try and write that down, or you try and write down something that isn't actually music, so bird song, for example, all of these things are going to be difficult to annotate using the stave notation that we're used to, because that notation has developed around annotating something particular, the codes of Western music. So this is the innovative barrier that we are investigating, or the potential barrier or limit or inhibition on creative thinking. So if you want to think outside of the box, if you want to think about something completely new, if we want to facilitate a paradigm shift, so we really do think about all sorts of things in a completely different way, is there potential for our language and particularly our notation to hold us back? And is there anything we can do about that? This brings us to another reference in the literature, which is Wittgenstein's theory of aspect seeing. One can imagine someone looking at this figure and seeing only the duck and not seeing the rabbit until we draw it to their attention. Wittgenstein calls this aspect blindness, and the subsequent realization he calls the dawning of an aspect. So we are interested in this environment of seeking innovation and creativity as to how we can facilitate the dawning of an aspect. So far as addressing the problem, is there something we can do about these limitations? That's going to come out of a clearer understanding of how these notations function at the moment, and which ones are apparently more flexible and more widely applicable. And so those are the areas that we're focusing on in the investigation. So in this paper, we looked at 18 different types of notation, ranging from written language, like written English or written Spanish, through a variety of other forms of writing, such as Egyptian hieroglyphs, to very symbolic forms of notation such as mathematics and logic. And we investigated these 18 different types of writing or script. You notice that we're using the term writing rather broadly. We mean any form of annotation, of permanent marks that record content. So we would count musical notation as a form of writing. So we investigated all 18 forms of annotation on two principal scales. The first was the degree of iconicity in the notation. So there are some forms of representation that we can understand very easily from how they appear. So something like airport signage, for example. It's designed to be easy to understand, but it's also quite a flexible system, and one can introduce new signs, and on the whole users will understand what they mean because they're used to extrapolating from the conventions they've already learned, and the signs clearly show what they're intended to refer to. At the opposite end of the spectrum, we have very symbolic forms of notation, such as symbolic logic or mathematics. These are sign systems that are completely arbitrary in the sense that their form is quite unlike what they represent, and we have to learn what the signs mean. They can be very powerful because, like written English or written Spanish, that's also a symbolic form of notation, and it has very wide application. But we have to learn the system, and we can't expand the system unless we learn those new signs, and the whole community needs to learn those signs. So there is a consensus around what constitutes the set of signs we're going to use, and we can't just expand them fairly freely ourselves. So the second dimension that we looked at was intrinsic or extrinsic, which we took to mean how easily the sign system could be applied beyond the boundary of the field for which it was originally designed. So most sign systems are relatively inflexible, particularly the symbolic ones. Something like musical notation can be applied to the recording of bird song, for example. Messiaen made compositions based on bird song. But as we get into electronic music and we need microtonal, we need to record microtonal sounds, so the stave notation becomes increasingly inflexible and inapplicable, and composers have developed things like graphic scores to try to get beyond the prescriptive limitations that in the world of music the sound palette is taken to be 12-tone Western music. At the most extrinsic end, at the most widely applicable end, you find natural languages. We can describe almost anything in natural language, in speech and in its accompanying writing. But there are limits, so we can't easily capture phenomenological experience, describing colour, describing music, for example, but on the whole we can apply language very widely across fields. At the opposite end, at the intrinsic end, at the least flexible end, something like logical notation is not much use for anything other than logic, or logic and mathematics, if one sees those as synonymous, because the sign systems have been developed to represent specific concepts in those fields, and they are non-iconic signs, so we have to learn what they mean. We can't see and intuit what they mean from their appearance. So what did we find when we'd analysed these 18 types of notation from across a wide range of fields in terms of the two key variables of iconicity, or symbolism at the other end of the scale, or extrinsicality, the degree to which it can be applied in other fields. So that's the extrinsic, intrinsic axis. And this graph shows what we found. Unsurprisingly, I think, there is a tendency from the bottom left to the top right, which shows that the more iconic a notation system is, the more widely it can be applied. And the reason I think one could expect that is because in iconic systems we can guess what new signs mean, or if signs are applied outside of where we would normally expect to find them, we can guess what that connection is from their appearance. That's not the case with symbolic notation systems, and so they tend to be locked into their specific domains and fields. But you can see from the graph that there are some exceptions to this, and those, of course, are the more interesting examples. So where does that take us? What are the conclusions that we report on in the conference paper? Well, there are three outcomes that we want to take further. The first is that the more iconic the notation system is, the more logographically it is working, such as airport signs, the more the notation system is recording propositions, so statements of fact. Because logographic systems tend to lack modality, so they can't express degrees and qualities and extents of things. So we suggest that they are tending to be propositional systems that are either stating things that are true or false. And this is particularly clear, I think, in the Mixtec picture writing. Second outcome is that intrinsic systems, so systems that are very bound up with their field, such as logical notation and mathematical notation, tend to be normative, which means that they begin to define the field. In other words, if it can't be annotated using logical notation, or if it cannot be annotated using mathematical notation, then it isn't logic or maths. So it defines what the content is. The third outcome of interest to us relates to our initial question, which is if notation systems have the capacity to limit our ability to think outside the box, is there anything we can do about that? And thinking back to the graph and the quadrants of the graph, we suggest that if one's working in an interdisciplinary space or in a very innovative environment where one's seeking to maximize the potential for capturing unfamiliar ideas, then one's looking for a notation system that occupies the upper right quadrant. In other words, one is looking for a notation system that has got an element of iconicity about it, because that will facilitate the understanding and development of capturing information using novel signs. And the second dimension is that it needs to be extrinsic, so it needs to be applicable in ways that are unfamiliar. So if one's taking an existing sign system and stretching it, we're looking for sign systems that have the capacity to be applied outside of where we would normally operate. Traditional stave notation hides the possibility of quarter tones hidden between the notes that we can easily annotate. So changing, in this case by supplementing the notation with additional signs, opens up a whole new set of possibilities. The dawning of an aspect that there exists quarter tones between the semitones with which we are familiar. So this is our current interest, the extent to which sign systems, notation systems restrict the way that we understand what we already know and our ability to think outside the box, and whether there is anything we can do about it, which we think there is, in extending and altering our notation system so that it can encompass new ideas. And that's the nature of the project. Thank you.